The world watched in stunned silence as flowers piled high outside Buckingham Palace, their petals wilting under the weight of a nation's grief. It was September 1997, and Princess Diana was dead. While millions mourned the people's princess, another drama unfolded behind the palace walls. One that would test the very foundation of the British monarchy. In the eye of this unprecedented storm stood Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, watching her mother face the most challenging moment of her 45-year reign. The public's anger was palpable, their demands growing louder by the hour. "Where is the Queen?" they cried. "Why won't she speak to us?" The monarchy teetered on the edge of a precipice, and Anne knew that one wrong move could send it tumbling into history. But what the world didn't know was the fierce battle being waged in the palace corridors, where a daughter's loyalty would be tested against a nation's fury, where royal protocol would clash with public emotion, and where Princess Anne would emerge as her mother's most unexpected defender. This is the story of those 7 crucial days that changed the monarchy forever, told through the eyes of the woman who refused to let her family's legacy crumble under the weight of public opinion. The stakes had never been higher. The crown had never been more vulnerable, and Princess Anne had never been more determined to protect the woman she called both queen and mother. The telephone rang at Gatcombe Park at 3:17 a.m. on August 31st, 1997. Princess Anne had been sleeping deeply after a long day at the horse trials, her body still aching from hours in the saddle. The shrill sound cut through the peaceful silence of her Gloucestershire home like a knife through silk. She reached for the receiver with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency calls, expecting perhaps news about an injured horse or a security matter. Sir Robert Fellowes' voice was strained, barely recognizable. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid I have terrible news. There's been an accident in Paris. The Princess of Wales." His voice broke. "She didn't survive." The words hit Anne like a physical blow. She sat up in bed, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Diana was dead. Her former sister-in-law, the woman who had brought such joy and chaos into their family, was gone. The immediate thought that followed was even more chilling. What would this mean for her mother, for the monarchy, for everything they had worked to protect?
Anne's relationship with Diana had been complicated, to say the least.
While the media often portrayed her as cold and distant toward the younger woman, the truth was far more nuanced. Anne had watched Diana's arrival into the royal family with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She had seen how unprepared Diana was for the weight of royal duty, how the young woman struggled with the constraints and expectations that came with marrying the heir to the throne. There had been moments of genuine connection between them. Anne remembered Diana's tentative questions about royal protocol, her nervous laughter during family gatherings, and the way she had tried so hard to fit into a world that seemed determined to remain foreign to her. But Anne had also witnessed Diana's growing frustration with royal life, her increasing willingness to challenge tradition, and ultimately, her decision to wage war against the institution through the media. The divorce had been particularly difficult for Anne to watch. As someone who had weathered her own marital difficulties with characteristic stoicism and privacy, she found it hard to understand Diana's decision to make her personal struggles so public. The Panorama interview had been especially painful for the entire family, watching Diana speak about feeling isolated and unsupported while cameras broadcast her words to millions around the world. But now, sitting in her darkened bedroom with the phone pressed to her ear, all of Anne's complicated feelings about Diana crystallized into a single, overwhelming concern for her mother. The Queen would be devastated not just by the loss of life, but by the implications for the monarchy. Anne knew her mother well enough to understand that Elizabeth II would be thinking not just as a grandmother who had lost the mother of her grandsons, but as a sovereign facing an unprecedented crisis. "Where is my mother now?" Anne asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "At Balmoral, with the Duke of Edinburgh and the young princes," Sir Robert replied. "The Queen is. She's holding up remarkably well, as you might expect. But Your Royal Highness, I must warn you, the initial reaction from the public is unlike anything we've seen before. The palace switchboard is already overwhelmed with calls, and there are people gathering outside the gates in London with flowers." Anne closed her eyes, visualizing the scene. She had lived through difficult periods for the royal family before: the Windsor Castle fire, the divorces, the various scandals that had plagued them throughout the 1990s. But this felt different. This felt like a reckoning. "I'll drive to Balmoral immediately," she said, already calculating the journey time in her head. "Have you spoken to Charles?" "His Royal Highness is flying back from Paris with the princess's body. He should arrive at RAF Northolt this afternoon." Anne felt a stab of sympathy for her older brother. Whatever had gone wrong in his marriage to Diana, she knew he had genuinely cared for her and would be struggling with guilt and grief in equal measure. She also knew that the public would be looking for someone to blame, and Charles, as Diana's ex-husband, would be an obvious target. After ending the call, Anne sat in the darkness for several minutes, letting the reality of the situation settle over her. As the Queen's only daughter, she had always felt a particular responsibility to protect her mother and the institution of the monarchy. She had spent her entire life watching Elizabeth II navigate the challenges of being both a sovereign and a human being, understanding better than most the weight of that dual responsibility. The drive to Balmoral gave Anne time to think, to plan, to prepare for what she knew would be the most challenging week of their lives. The Scottish countryside rolled past her windows in the early morning light, the familiar landscape offering some comfort as her mind worked through the implications of what had happened. She thought about her mother's nature, about how the Queen processed grief and trauma. Elizabeth II had been trained from birth to suppress her personal emotions in service of her duty as monarch. It was both her greatest strength and, in times like this, potentially her greatest vulnerability. The public expected their royals to show emotion, to demonstrate that they shared in the nation's grief. But the Queen had been conditioned to do precisely the opposite. Anne understood this better than most of her family members. She had inherited her mother's sense of duty, her commitment to putting the crown before personal feelings. But she had also learned from watching the changing relationship between the monarchy and the public throughout her lifetime. The deference that had once protected royal privacy was eroding, replaced by a demand for accessibility and emotional transparency that the older generation of royals found difficult to navigate. By the time Anne reached Balmoral, the sun was climbing higher in the Scottish sky, and she could see the strain on her mother's face despite Elizabeth II's composed exterior. The Queen had been awake all night, dealing with the immediate practical concerns, ensuring that Charles could travel to Paris safely, coordinating with the government, managing the unprecedented media attention that was already building. "Mama," Anne said simply, embracing her mother with unusual demonstrativeness. The Queen accepted the comfort gratefully, allowing herself a brief moment of human vulnerability before the mask of sovereignty settled back into place. "The boys are still sleeping," the Queen said quietly. "They don't know yet. Charles will tell them when he returns." Anne nodded, understanding the delicate balance her mother was trying to maintain. William and Harry needed to grieve as children, as sons who had lost their mother. But they were also princes, and their grief would be scrutinized and analyzed by millions of people around the world. "What are you thinking about the public response?" Anne asked, knowing that her mother would have been monitoring the situation throughout the night. The Queen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's intense. More than we anticipated. The palace is reporting crowds gathering, and the media coverage is unlike anything we've experienced. There are calls for us to return to London for public statements. She paused, clearly struggling with the expectations being placed upon her. Anne recognized the conflict in her mother's voice. The Queen's instincts told her to stay at Balmoral, to protect her grandsons and allow them to process their grief privately. Royal protocol supported this decision. Traditionally, the royal family dealt with personal matters away from public scrutiny. But the public was demanding something different, something unprecedented. "They want to see us grieve," Anne said, putting into words what they both understood. "They want public displays of emotion, which is exactly what we cannot give them without compromising everything the monarchy represents," the Queen replied, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal tradition. It was in this moment that Anne realized the true scope of the crisis they faced. This wasn't just about managing public relations or navigating media attention. This was about the fundamental nature of the monarchy itself, about whether the institution could survive the collision between traditional royal stoicism and modern expectations for emotional accessibility. As reports continued to arrive throughout the day, crowds growing larger outside Buckingham Palace, media criticism mounting, public anger building, Anne found herself in an unusual position. She was watching her mother face criticism unlike anything in her long reign, seeing the Queen struggle with expectations that seemed to contradict everything she had been taught about duty and appropriate royal behavior. By evening, when Charles arrived back from Paris, exhausted and emotionally shattered, the situation had escalated beyond anything they had imagined. The word heartless was being used to describe the royal family's response. There were calls for the Queen to abdicate, suggestions that the monarchy was out of touch and irrelevant. Anne listened to the reports with growing anger. Not at the public. She understood their grief and confusion, but at the unfairness of the criticism being leveled at her mother. The Queen had spent 72 years of her life in service to the nation, had sacrificed personal desires and emotions for the sake of duty, had weathered countless storms with grace and dignity. And now, when she was trying to protect her grandsons and maintain the stability that the monarchy provided, she was being attacked for it. That night, as the rest of the family tried to process the day's events, Anne made a decision that would define her actions for the remainder of the week. She would not allow her mother to face this crisis alone. She would not stand by and watch the Queen be vilified for trying to balance her roles as sovereign and grandmother. If the monarchy was under attack, Anne would defend it with everything she had. But she also understood that traditional approaches would not be sufficient for this unprecedented situation. The rules had changed, the public's expectations had shifted, and the royal family would need to adapt or risk losing the support that had sustained the monarchy for centuries. Anne spent the remainder of the evening at Balmoral thinking, planning, and preparing for what she knew would be the fight of her family's lives. The woman who had spent her entire adult life serving the crown was about to discover that sometimes the most loyal act is knowing when to encourage change, even when that change challenges everything you've been taught to believe. By Monday morning, September 1st, the situation had escalated beyond anyone's worst fears. Anne woke early at Balmoral to find her mother already dressed and standing by the window, watching the Scottish mist roll across the grounds. The Queen's posture was rigid, her face composed, but Anne could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she held her morning tea. "The newspapers," the Queen said simply, not turning from the window. Anne had already seen them. The headlines were brutal, unforgiving, and unlike anything directed at the monarchy in living memory. "Show us you care," screamed one tabloid. "Where is our Queen?" demanded another. The criticism wasn't limited to the tabloids. Even the traditionally supportive broadsheets were questioning the royal family's response to Diana's death. "They're calling for you to return to London," Anne said, settling into the chair beside her mother. "The palace staff are fielding hundreds of calls demanding a public statement, a show of grief, some acknowledgement of what Diana meant to the people." Elizabeth II finally turned from the window, and Anne could see the weight of the crisis etched in her mother's features. "I have been queen for 45 years, she said quietly. "I have guided this nation through wars, recessions, scandals, and constitutional crises. I have never faced anything like this." Anne understood the complexity of her mother's position better than most. The Queen had been taught from childhood that displays of personal emotion were inappropriate for a monarch, that the crown must remain above the fray of public sentiment. Royal grief was meant to be private, dignified, removed from the chaos of public opinion. But Diana had changed the rules of engagement between the monarchy and the people, and her death had crystallized a demand for a different kind of royal response. The irony was not lost on Anne that Diana, who had struggled so much with royal protocol in life, was forcing the most significant change in royal behavior through her death. The public that had embraced Diana's emotional accessibility was now demanding that same accessibility from the rest of the royal family, particularly from the Queen. Throughout the morning, reports continued to arrive that painted an increasingly alarming picture. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace were growing larger and more vocal. Flowers were being piled so high against the palace gates that groundskeepers couldn't keep up with them. More troubling were the signs of genuine anger beginning to emerge from the crowd. Shouts about royal indifference, calls for the Queen to show herself. Charles appeared in the breakfast room looking haggard and overwhelmed. The flight back from Paris had been a nightmare, with photographers pursuing the plane carrying Diana's body, and the atmosphere at the airport had been charged with emotion and barely contained anger. He had spent the night with his sons, trying to help them process their grief, while dealing with his own complicated feelings about Diana's death and the public's response to it. "The boys are asking questions I don't know how to answer," Charles said, slumping into his chair. "William wants to know why people are angry with us. Harry keeps asking when we're going home. I don't know what to tell them." Anne felt her heart break for her nephews. At 15 and 12, William and Harry were old enough to understand that their mother was gone, but too young to comprehend the political implications of her death. They were grieving children who needed protection and stability, but they were also princes, whose every move would be scrutinized and analyzed. "The Prime Minister has called twice this morning," the Queen announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Blair is concerned about the public mood. He's suggesting that we consider returning to London earlier than planned." Anne could hear the conflict in her mother's voice. Tony Blair represented a new kind of politics, one that prioritized public opinion and media management in ways that the old establishment found foreign and sometimes distasteful. But he also understood the current mood in a way that the royal family was struggling to grasp. "What did you tell him?" Anne asked. "That we would consider his advice," the Queen replied diplomatically, "but that our first priority remains the well-being of the children." As the day progressed, the pressure continued to mount from all sides. Palace staff reported that the phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from the public, most demanding that the Queen return to London and make a public statement. Media coverage was becoming increasingly critical, with commentators questioning not just the royal family's response to Diana's death, but their relevance to modern Britain. Anne found herself in a unique position during these discussions. Unlike her brothers, she had never been heir to the throne or held a senior position in the line of succession. This had given her a certain freedom to speak more directly to her mother, to challenge royal thinking in ways that others might find difficult. "Mama," she said during one of their private conversations that afternoon, "I think we need to consider that the rules might have changed." The Queen looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Diana changed how the public expects royals to behave. She made emotion and accessibility part of what they expect from us. Her death isn't just a family tragedy. It's being treated as a national trauma that requires a national response. The crown cannot be subject to the whims of public emotion," Elizabeth II replied firmly. "The moment we start governing our behavior based on newspaper headlines and public demonstrations, we lose the dignity and stability that are our primary contributions to national life." Anne understood her mother's position, and in many ways she agreed with it. The monarchy's value lay partly in its consistency, its ability to provide continuity and stability regardless of changing political winds or public moods, but she could also see that their current approach was failing dramatically. "But if the public loses faith in us completely," Anne countered, "then dignity and stability won't matter, because we won't have the support necessary to maintain the monarchy." It was a bold statement, and Anne could see her mother processing it carefully. The Queen had never faced a situation where the monarchy's very survival seemed to be at stake based on public opinion. Previous royal crises had been weathered through time and discretion, but this felt different, more immediate, more threatening to the institution itself. By evening, the situation had deteriorated further. Television news was broadcasting footage of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, and the mood was becoming increasingly hostile. There were reports of people in the crowd making negative comments about the Queen, questioning her commitment to her people, comparing her unfavorably to Diana. Anne watched the coverage with growing alarm, not just for her mother, but for what it meant for the future of the monarchy. She could see that they were facing a fundamental crisis of legitimacy, a moment when the traditional relationship between the crown and the people was being called into question. That night, after the rest of the family had gone to bed, Anne and her mother sat together in the Queen's private sitting room at Balmoral. The room was warm and comfortable, filled with personal photographs and familiar objects that spoke to a lifetime of service and duty. It was here, in this private space, that Anne decided to have the most difficult conversation of her life. "Mama, I think we're facing something unprecedented," she began carefully. "This isn't just about managing public relations or waiting for the attention to die down. I think the public is genuinely questioning whether we understand or care about their feelings." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that flickered in the grate. "Do you think I don't care?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course not," Anne replied immediately. "I know how much you care about this country and its people. I've watched you dedicate your entire life to service. But caring privately isn't enough anymore. The public needs to see that care, to feel connected to it." "And how exactly do you suggest I do that?" the Queen asked, and Anne could hear the frustration in her voice. "Shall I weep on television? Shall I give interviews about my personal feelings? Shall I abandon everything I was taught about duty and dignity?" Anne leaned forward, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think you need to abandon anything. But I think you might need to find a way to show the public that the crown can adapt, that it can acknowledge their grief without compromising its essential character." The conversation continued late into the night, with Anne carefully walking the line between supporting her mother and encouraging her to consider changes that went against everything the Queen had been taught about appropriate royal behavior. It was exhausting work, requiring all of Anne's diplomatic skills and deep understanding of her mother's character. As Tuesday morning approached, bringing with it the promise of even more intense pressure and scrutiny, Anne found herself in the unexpected role of strategic advisor to the crown. She was no longer just a daughter supporting her mother through a difficult time. She had become an advocate for adaptation, for finding a way to preserve the monarchy by allowing it to evolve. The conversation with her mother had clarified something important for Anne. The greatest threat to the monarchy wasn't change. It was the failure to change when circumstances demanded it. Diana's death had created a moment when the old rules no longer applied, when the public expected something different from their royal family. Anne understood that defending her mother and the monarchy might require encouraging them both to do things that felt foreign and uncomfortable. It was a complex form of loyalty, one that required her to challenge the very tradition she had been raised to protect. As she finally made her way to bed in the early hours of Tuesday morning, Anne was already formulating plans for the battles that lay ahead. She knew that the coming days would test every principle she had ever held about royal duty and behavior. But she also knew that the stakes were too high for anything less than complete commitment to finding a solution. The storm was building, and Anne was preparing to guide her family through it, even if it meant challenging everything they thought they knew about being royal. Tuesday, September 2nd, dawned grey and oppressive at Balmoral, matching the mood that had settled over the castle like a suffocating blanket. Anne woke to find that the situation had deteriorated overnight in ways she hadn't thought possible. The morning briefing from the palace painted a picture of a nation in crisis, with the royal family at the centre of a storm that showed no signs of abating. The overnight coverage had been particularly brutal. Television programs had featured panels of experts dissecting the royal family's response, with many concluding that the monarchy was fundamentally out of touch with modern Britain. More alarmingly, there were reports of organised demonstrations being planned, with Republican groups seeing Diana's death as an opportunity to call for the abolition of the monarchy altogether. Anne found her mother in the castle's library, surrounded by newspapers and briefing papers, her breakfast untouched on the table beside her. The Queen's face was pale but determined, and Anne could see that she had been working since dawn, trying to understand and respond to the unprecedented crisis they faced. "The flowers," the Queen said without looking up. "They're reporting that the carpet of flowers outside Buckingham Palace now stretches for hundreds of yards. People are travelling from all over the country to leave tributes to Diana." Anne sat down across from her mother, noting the careful way the Queen pronounced Diana's name. Even in private, even in crisis, Elizabeth II maintained the formal precision that had characterized her entire reign. It was both admirable and, Anne was beginning to understand, part of the problem they faced. People need somewhere to focus their grief, Anne said carefully. Diana represented something to them that went beyond her role as a princess. She was a symbol of accessibility, of emotional connection. Her death has left them feeling lost. "I understand that," the Queen replied, finally looking up from her papers. "What I don't understand is why that requires me to abandon 45 years of constitutional precedent and appropriate royal behaviour." It was then that Anne realised her mother was fighting two battles simultaneously. She was trying to manage an unprecedented public relations crisis while also wrestling with a fundamental challenge to her understanding of what it meant to be queen. The criticism wasn't just about her response to Diana's death, it was about her entire approach to monarchy. The morning brought a stream of visitors and phone calls that illustrated the severity of the situation. Tony Blair called again, this time with barely concealed urgency in his voice as he described the mood in London. Palace officials arrived with reports of staff being verbally abused by members of the public, of security concerns at royal residences, of a general atmosphere of hostility that none of them had experienced before. Most troubling of all was a call from the Archbishop of Canterbury, who reported that he was receiving inquiries about whether the Church of England should distance itself from the royal family's response to Diana's death. The suggestion that the monarchy might lose the support of the established church, one of its most fundamental pillars of support, sent shockwaves through the family. Charles spent much of the day dealing with practical arrangements for Diana's funeral, while also trying to shield his sons from the worst of the media coverage. But William and Harry were not entirely insulated from what was happening, and their questions were becoming more difficult to answer. They wanted to know why people were angry with their grandmother, why they couldn't go home to London, why their mother's death had become the centre of such controversy. Anne watched her brother struggling to balance his roles as father and prince, and she could see the toll the situation was taking on him. Charles had always been sensitive to public opinion, perhaps more so than the rest of the family, and the current level of criticism was devastating for him personally, while also threatening his future as king. It was during lunch on Tuesday that Anne made her most direct intervention in the crisis. The family was gathered around the dining table at Balmoral, picking at their food while updates arrived from London every few minutes. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone struggling to maintain normal conversation while the foundations of their world seemed to be shifting beneath them. "We need to go back to London," Anne said suddenly, breaking into a discussion about funeral arrangements. The table fell silent. Charles looked up sharply while the Queen set down her fork with unusual force. "I beg your pardon," the Queen said, her voice carrying a warning that Anne had heard many times over the years. "We need to go back to London," Anne repeated, meeting her mother's gaze steadily. "The longer we stay here, the more it looks like we're hiding, like we don't care about what the people are going through." "We are protecting the children," the Queen replied firmly. "We are allowing them to grieve privately, as is appropriate." "But the public doesn't see it that way," Anne continued, knowing she was walking into dangerous territory, but pressing on regardless. "They see absence, they see indifference. They see a royal family that has removed itself from the nation's moment of greatest emotional need." Charles cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Anne has a point, Mama. The advice from Downing Street is becoming quite insistent. Blair thinks we're facing a constitutional crisis if we don't respond more visibly to public sentiment." The Queen's expression hardened. "Since when do we take political direction on matters of royal protocol?" It was a fair question, and one that struck at the heart of the constitutional relationship between the Crown and the government. Traditionally, the monarchy maintained its independence from political pressure, making decisions based on established precedent and royal prerogative. But these were not traditional circumstances. "Since the alternative might be the end of the monarchy as we know it," Anne said quietly. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Anne had said what everyone was thinking, but no one had dared to voice, that they were facing an existential threat to the institution they had all been born to serve and protect. The Queen stood up from the table, her movements sharp with controlled anger. "I will not be blackmailed into inappropriate behavior by newspaper headlines and mob sentiment," she said. "The Crown has survived far worse than this by maintaining its dignity and its principles." But as she left the room, Anne could see the uncertainty in her mother's posture, the way her shoulders seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there just days before. The Queen was being forced to confront the possibility that the very principles she had used to guide her entire reign might now be working against the survival of the monarchy. That afternoon, Anne took an unprecedented step. She asked to speak privately with the palace's senior communications staff, effectively bypassing her mother's authority to gather intelligence about the true scope of the crisis they faced. It was a decision that went against everything she had been taught about royal hierarchy and protocol. But she felt that desperate times required desperate measures. The briefing she received was even more alarming than she had expected. Public opinion polling was showing unprecedented levels of criticism toward the royal family, with particular focus on the Queen's apparent lack of response to Diana's death. More concerning was the speed with which Republican sentiment was growing, with organised groups calling for protests and some politicians beginning to question the monarchy's role in modern Britain. "Your Royal Highness," one of the senior press officers said carefully, "we're facing something that none of us have experience with. The traditional approaches, waiting for attention to die down, maintaining dignified silence, they're not working. If anything, they're making things worse." Anne absorbed this information with growing alarm, understanding that her instincts about the severity of the crisis had been correct. The monarchy wasn't just facing a public relations problem, it was facing a fundamental challenge to its legitimacy and relevance. That evening, she returned to Balmoral with a clearer understanding of what they were up against and a more urgent sense of the need for decisive action. She found her mother in the drawing room, staring out at the Scottish landscape with an expression of deep contemplation. "I spoke with the communications staff today," Anne said without preamble. The Queen turned to look at her daughter, and Anne could see a flash of irritation in her eyes. "That was not your place." "Perhaps not," Anne acknowledged, "but I needed to understand what we're really facing. Mama, this is bigger than anything we've dealt with before. The public isn't just upset, they're questioning the very foundation of what we represent." The Queen was quiet for a long moment, and Anne could see her processing this information alongside everything else she had been told over the past few days. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked finally. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do is encourage change when change is necessary for survival," Anne said. "I'm suggesting that defending the monarchy might require us to do things that feel wrong, that go against our training, that challenge our understanding of appropriate royal behavior." It was a conversation that continued long into the night, with Anne carefully building her case for why returning to London and making some kind of public acknowledgement of Diana's death was not just advisable but essential for the survival of the monarchy. She drew on her understanding of her mother's character, her deep love of country and commitment to the Crown, to argue that adaptation was not betrayal but the highest form of service. By the time they parted that night, Anne could see that her mother was beginning to consider possibilities that would have been unthinkable just days before. The Queen was slowly recognizing that the rules of the game had changed, that the public's relationship with the monarchy had fundamentally shifted, and that surviving this crisis would require unprecedented flexibility. As Anne prepared for bed, she reflected on how much had changed in just 3 days. She had gone from being a supportive daughter to becoming a strategic advisor, from defending traditional royal values to advocating for radical adaptation. It was a transformation that surprised even her, driven by her recognition that sometimes protecting the institution requires challenging its most fundamental assumptions. The turning point had been reached. Now the question was whether the Queen would have the courage to act on it, and whether the royal family could successfully navigate the treacherous waters that lay ahead. Anne had done everything she could to prepare her mother for what was coming next. The rest would depend on Elizabeth II's ability to balance her deep respect for tradition with her equally deep commitment to the survival of the crown. Wednesday morning brought news that changed everything. Anne was awakened not by her alarm clock or the usual sounds of Balmoral coming to life, but by urgent knocking on her door. Her private secretary entered with an expression that immediately told her something significant had occurred during the night. "Your Royal Highness, there's been a development. The crowds in London, they've grown beyond anything we anticipated. The police are expressing concerns about crowd control, and there are reports of Republican demonstrators organizing counter-protests for the weekend." Anne dressed quickly and made her way to her mother's private office, where she found the Queen already dressed and reviewing overnight reports with a grave expression. The situation that had seemed manageable through traditional royal crisis management techniques was spiraling beyond their control. "The flowers have now completely covered the palace gates," the Queen said without looking up. "They're estimating that over 1 million people have visited the site since Monday. The crowd last night was singing God Save the Queen, but not, it seems, in support." Anne felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that God Save the Queen could be sung as a protest rather than an anthem of support represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the monarchy and the people that she had never imagined possible. The morning briefing painted an even more alarming picture. Television news was now running continuous coverage of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, with reporters interviewing people who expressed anger and disappointment with the royal family's response. More troubling were the increasingly organized nature of the criticism and the emergence of political figures who were beginning to question the monarchy's role in modern Britain. Charles arrived at the meeting looking haggard and worn down by the pressure of the past few days. "The boys are asking when we can go home," he said. "They don't understand why we can't leave Scotland, and frankly, I'm running out of explanations that make sense to them." Anne could see the toll this was taking on her brother. Charles had always been more emotionally expressive than the rest of the family, more willing to engage with public sentiment, and the current situation was forcing him into an impossible position. He needed to grieve for Diana, while also managing his son's grief, all while facing unprecedented public criticism. "The Archbishop called again this morning," the Queen announced. "He's suggesting that the Church might need to make its own statement about Diana's death if we don't address the situation soon." The implication was clear: the Church cannot be seen as aligned with our apparent indifference. This news hit Anne like a physical blow. The Church of England had been one of the monarchy's most reliable sources of support for centuries. If the established Church began to distance itself from the royal family, it would represent a crack in the foundation of the constitutional system that could have devastating long-term consequences. It was at this moment that Anne realized her careful campaign of persuasion over the past few days had reached its culmination. Her mother was facing a convergence of pressures that made the traditional royal approach of dignified silence not just inadequate but actively dangerous to the survival of the monarchy. "Mama," Anne said carefully,
I think we need to consider that we're not just managing a crisis anymore.
"we're facing a potential transformation of the entire relationship between the Crown and the people." The Queen looked at her daughter sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we need to return to London today, that you need to make a public statement acknowledging Diana's death and the nation's grief, that we need to be visible at the funeral in a way that shows we understand what she meant to people." The room fell silent. Charles looked up hopefully, while the Queen's expression hardened into the mask of controlled consideration that Anne had seen countless times over the years when her mother was wrestling with difficult decisions. "You're asking me to abandon the principles that have guided my entire reign," the Queen said slowly. "You're asking me to bow to public pressure and media manipulation."
No, Anne replied firmly. I'm asking you to save the monarchy by allowing it to evolve.
"I'm asking you to recognize that sometimes the most traditional thing you can do is adapt to ensure survival." What followed was the most intense conversation Anne had ever had with her mother. For over an hour, they debated the nature of royal duty, the relationship between tradition and adaptation, and the question of whether responding to public pressure represented leadership or capitulation. Anne drew on every argument she had been developing over the past few days, every insight she had gained into the changing nature of the public's relationship with the monarchy. She spoke about Diana's legacy, about the way she had changed expectations for royal behavior, about the danger of appearing irrelevant or out of touch with the nation's emotional needs. The public isn't asking you to stop being queen, Anne argued. They're asking you to be queen in a way that acknowledges their feelings, that shows you understand what Diana meant to them. And if I do this, the Queen asked, if I make this public statement and return to London, what precedent does that set? What happens the next time there's a crisis and the public demands that I behave in ways that compromise royal dignity? It was a fair question, and one that got to the heart of the constitutional implications of what Anne was proposing. If the monarch began making decisions based on public pressure rather than established protocol, it could fundamentally alter the nature of the Crown's independence and authority. I think, Anne said carefully, that we cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, we need to focus on surviving this crisis, with the monarchy intact. The debate continued through lunch, with other family members and senior advisors joining the conversation. Tony Blair called twice during the afternoon, each time with more urgent reports about the situation in London and stronger recommendations that the royal family return immediately. It was late in the afternoon when the Queen finally made her decision. Anne was in the castle's garden, trying to clear her head after hours of intense discussion, when her mother found her walking among the roses that had been Diana's favourite flowers during family visits to Balmoral. "We'll return to London tomorrow," the Queen said simply. "I'll make a statement on Friday before the funeral. You've convinced me that the risks of not acting outweigh the risks of compromising traditional protocol." Anne felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had gotten what she had been arguing for, but she understood the magnitude of what she had encouraged her mother to do. Elizabeth II was essentially agreeing to fundamentally alter her approach to being queen, to embrace a more emotionally accessible style of monarchy that went against everything she had been taught.
Are you sure about this? Anne asked, giving her mother one final opportunity to reconsider.
"No," the Queen replied honestly. "But you've convinced me that uncertainty about the right path is less dangerous than certainty about the wrong one." That evening, as preparations began for their return to London, Anne found herself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred over the past few days. She had gone from being a supportive family member to becoming the architect of a fundamental change in royal behaviour. It was a responsibility that she hadn't sought, but had embraced when the survival of the monarchy was at stake. The announcement of their return to London was made that night, and the response was immediate and positive. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace erupted in cheers when they learned that the Queen would be returning to address the nation. Media coverage shifted from criticism to anticipation, with commentators praising the royal family's decision to respond to public sentiment. But Anne knew that the real test was still to come. Returning to London and making a public statement were just the first steps in what would need to be a carefully managed transformation of how the monarchy engaged with the public's emotions and expectations. As she packed for the journey back to London, Anne thought about Diana and the role she had played, even in death, in forcing the royal family to confront the changing nature of their relationship with the British people. Diana had always challenged royal conventions, and her final challenge was perhaps the most significant of all, forcing the monarchy to choose between tradition and survival. Anne had spent the past few days defending her mother and the crown by encouraging them to change, to adapt, to embrace a different way of being royal. It was a complex form of loyalty, one that required her to challenge the very institution she was trying to protect. The decision had been made. The Queen would return to London, would speak to the nation about Diana's death, would participate in the funeral in a way that acknowledged the public's emotional investment in the Princess of Wales. It was unprecedented, but then again, so was the crisis they faced. As the royal convoy prepared to leave Balmoral on Thursday morning, Anne looked back at the castle that had provided refuge during the most challenging week of their lives. They were returning to London as a different royal family than the one that had left 5 days earlier, changed by their encounter with a level of public emotion and expectation that none of them had experienced before. Anne had successfully defended her mother and the monarchy, but she had done so by convincing them both to become something new, something that could survive in a world where Diana's legacy had permanently altered the rules of royal engagement. The real test of whether her defense had been successful would come in the months and years ahead, as they learned to navigate this new relationship with the British people. The journey from Balmoral to London on Thursday, September 4th, was unlike any royal motorcade Anne had ever experienced. As their convoy made its way through Scotland and into England, crowds gathered at bridges and roadsides, not with the usual celebratory atmosphere of royal visits, but with a mixture of anticipation, hope, and residual tension that reflected the unprecedented nature of their return. Anne sat beside her mother in the royal car, watching the Queen's profile as she observed the crowds through the window. Elizabeth II's expression was carefully composed, but Anne could see the slight tension around her eyes, the way her hands rested precisely in her lap, signs that her mother was preparing for what might be the most challenging performance of her reign. "Are you nervous about tomorrow's broadcast?" Anne asked quietly, referring to the televised statement the Queen would make on Friday evening, just hours before Diana's funeral. "I have been making public speeches for over 40 years, the Queen replied. "But I've never made one quite like this." Anne understood what her mother meant. Tomorrow's statement would not be a traditional royal address about duty or celebration. It would be an acknowledgement of emotion, a recognition of public grief, and an attempt to bridge the gap between royal protocol and human feeling that had opened so dramatically over the past week. The scenes that greeted them upon their arrival in London exceeded even Anne's expectations. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace had continued to grow throughout the week, and the sea of flowers, cards, and tributes now stretched for blocks in every direction. But more significant than the size of the crowd was its mood. The anger and hostility that had characterized much of the week had been replaced by hope and anticipation. As their car passed through the palace gates, Anne could hear the crowd singing "God Save the Queen," and this time it sounded like the anthem of support she had grown up hearing rather than the protest it had become earlier in the week. The decision to return to London had already begun to repair the relationship between the monarchy and the people, but Anne knew that the real test was still ahead. Friday morning dawned grey and solemn, fitting for what would be one of the most emotionally charged days in recent British history. Anne woke early and went to check on her mother, finding the Queen already dressed and reviewing the final text of her evening broadcast with meticulous attention to detail. "I've been thinking about what you said at Balmoral," the Queen said without looking up from her papers. "About Diana changing the rules of engagement between the monarchy and the people." Anne settled into the chair across from her mother's desk, recognizing the reflective mood that often preceded major decisions or speeches.
What specifically?
"You were right that she represented something new, something that the public responded to in ways we didn't fully understand at the time. Her accessibility, her willingness to show emotion, her ability to connect with people's feelings rather than just their sense of duty." The Queen paused, setting down her speech and finally meeting Anne's eyes. "What I've realized this week is that her death has forced us to confront whether the monarchy can survive without incorporating some of those qualities into how we operate. It was perhaps the most direct acknowledgement Anne had ever heard her mother make about the need for fundamental change in royal behaviour. Elizabeth II had always been remarkably adaptable within the constraints of traditional protocol, but what she was describing now went beyond adaptation to transformation. The day proceeded with careful preparations for both Diana's funeral and the Queen's evening broadcast. Anne found herself in the unusual position of helping to coordinate between these events while also managing her own emotional response to what was unfolding. She had spent the week defending her mother's actions and encouraging change, but she was also grieving Diana and grappling with her own complicated feelings about the princess's death and its aftermath. Diana's funeral was a masterpiece of ceremony and emotion that seemed to satisfy both traditional royal protocol and the public's need for an acknowledgement of their feelings about the princess. Anne watched as her mother participated in the service with dignity, while also showing, in subtle but important ways, her recognition of Diana's significance to the nation. The sight of William and Harry walking behind their mother's coffin was heartbreaking, and Anne felt a fierce protectiveness toward her nephews as they navigated this most public of private griefs. But she also recognized that their composure and dignity were helping to restore the public's respect for the royal family's ability to balance duty with humanity. It was the Queen's evening broadcast, however, that would prove to be the most significant moment of the entire week. Anne joined the rest of the family in the palace drawing room to watch as her mother prepared to speak to the nation in a way that broke decades of precedent. The speech itself was a masterpiece of carefully calibrated emotion and tradition. The Queen acknowledged Diana's death as a loss not just for the royal family, but for the entire nation, spoke about her admiration for Diana's work and her dedication to her sons, and recognized the public's grief while maintaining the dignity and authority that was central to her role as monarch. She was an exceptional and gifted human being, the Queen said, speaking directly to the camera with an intensity that Anne had rarely seen in her mother's public appearances. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. But it was the Queen's acknowledgement of her own struggles that week that proved most significant. I, for one, believe that there are lessons to be drawn from her life, and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory. Anne watched her mother deliver these words and recognized the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Elizabeth II was not just acknowledging Diana's death or the public's grief. She was acknowledging that the monarchy had learned something from the crisis, that it was capable of change and growth. The response to the broadcast was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Within hours, the mood outside Buckingham Palace had transformed completely, with crowds cheering and singing with enthusiasm that hadn't been heard since the early days of the Queen's reign. Media coverage shifted from criticism to praise, with commentators acknowledging that the royal family had successfully navigated an unprecedented crisis. But Anne understood that the real victory wasn't in the positive media coverage or the restored public support, it was in the demonstration that the monarchy could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. Her mother had shown that it was possible to be emotionally accessible without compromising royal dignity, to acknowledge public sentiment without abandoning constitutional principles. In the weeks that followed Diana's death and funeral, Anne watched as her mother gradually incorporated the lessons learned during that crisis week into her regular approach to royal duties. The Queen became more willing to show emotion in public, more responsive to public sentiment, and more accessible in her interactions with the British people. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Elizabeth II remained fundamentally committed to duty, protocol, and the traditions that had sustained the monarchy for centuries. But there was a new flexibility in how she interpreted those traditions, a greater willingness to consider how royal behavior might need to evolve, to remain relevant and meaningful to contemporary audiences. Anne reflected often on her role during that crucial week, on the way she had found herself challenging her mother and the institution she had been raised to revere. It had been the most difficult balancing act of her life, defending the monarchy by encouraging it to change, protecting tradition by advocating for adaptation. The success of that approach became evident in the years that followed, as public support for the monarchy remained strong despite other challenges and changes. The Queen's willingness to adapt, demonstrated so clearly during the week following Diana's death, had helped ensure the institution's survival and relevance for future generations. Years later, when historians and royal biographers wrote about the crisis following Diana's death, many focused on the public pressure and political maneuvering that forced the royal family's response. But Anne knew that the real story was more complex and more personal. It was about a daughter who loved her mother enough to challenge her, a queen who was wise enough to listen, and a monarchy that proved it could change without losing its soul. The week following Diana's death had tested everything Anne believed about royal duty, family loyalty, and the nature of tradition itself. She had emerged from it with a deeper understanding of what it meant to defend something by allowing it to evolve, to protect an institution by helping it adapt to new realities. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most profound act of loyalty is having the courage to suggest that the people and institutions you love might need to become something different in order to survive. Diana's death had forced that lesson upon the royal family, and Anne had helped ensure they learned it well enough to emerge stronger on the other side. The Queen's broadcast that Friday evening had marked the beginning of a new era in royal public relations, one characterized by greater emotional accessibility without abandoning the dignity and stability that remained the monarchy's greatest gifts to the nation. Anne had played a crucial role in making that transformation possible, defending her mother and the crown by helping them both discover new ways to fulfill their ancient responsibilities in a modern world. As she looked back on those 7 days that changed everything, Anne understood that she had witnessed and participated in one of the most significant moments in the history of the British monarchy. It had been a crisis that could have destroyed the institution, but instead had strengthened it by forcing it to evolve. Her defense of the Queen's actions had succeeded not by justifying the old ways, but by helping create new ones that honored the past while embracing the future.